Let's see here.
And I recorded directly, Jonathan.
Yeah, I'm recording to the cloud, and then this will be going up on the meetup
You're
page.
just gonna post that. Okay.
Yep. So thanks everyone for joining. Mike is one of the developers at Rapid Development Group, and today we'll be sharing a topic that he is calling submitting Drupal pull requests and applying them immediately, which sounds really fancy, but
yeah,
we'll see
it's
what
not
that
exactly. So upon putting this together, when I wrote this article, it didn't make sense to cover the whole gamut of how do you modify a module, create a pull request, and kind of go down that whole road. And I figured this might be a good time to just talk about more generally, at least at first, some of the processes that Drupal has in terms of how you would change something if you need to, like Jonathan was saying, if things don't do what you say or what you want, and or things, if there's a bug, chances are good that you've seen the issue queue on Drupal's website when you go and you're searching for either an issue or something that doesn't work exactly how you want. And so the issue queue is where we often land, and it has all of the different problems categorized. And that process has changed a little bit in the past year. So I figured I'd start by just talking about that process in terms of what do you do, not only if you want to change something, but what do you want to do if you find an issue that applies to you and you want to use those changes in your current code. Because like I said, that's a little bit different. But not as different as I initially thought. So
so maybe you can set the stage by telling us about the specific case that started you down this road.
Sure. So the particular use case for me this time was that I was developing a website that needed to talk with Chase for accepting payment, accepting credit card. And there is the commerce module suite within Drupal that you can use for e-commerce. And there is a work in progress Chase module that integrates, but the module was really written for one particular use case, the one project that needed it so far, which is not unreasonable and uncommon. Someone wrote it to fit what they needed. But Chase, unlike a lot of other things like Authorize.net or PayPal, has an extremely large amount of variability in how you interact, depending on what you get certified for, what type of transactions you're running. And so, you know, after having gone through the whole thing, this is kind of a side note. I don't even know. I question whether or not the Chase integration should be a module at all, or if it should be something that at most is something small that can just point you in the right direction, but gives you the opportunity to do a lot of custom development, because it's pretty unlikely that two sites are going to be the same. And so a module doesn't help us out quite as much in that regard, because you can't simply install it and get it working. In fact, I can guarantee that's not going to work in this case, because you have to be certified with Chase. So, you know, so you can download the module, and then maybe I don't know if I'm going too off topic here, but the interesting thing with this too is that from Chase's perspective, in order to certify you, you're creating custom code. They don't care that you're using Drupal, Commerce, whatever. They're certifying you that you've written code that interacts with their system and does it in a safe way and meets their expectations. And what's really happening on our end is we're installing a module, which to us seems like, well, this is code that's been used before, so it shouldn't have a problem being certified. They don't care that it's been shared among a couple different people. To them, it's custom code. So even if you almost have to know the code intimately at some point or another in order to work through the certification process. So you can download and install the module as you normally would, but you're going to end up having to get pretty familiar with the code that's actually in the module. So anyway, that's kind of the whole situation that I found myself working through the progression of, well, first I need to create an issue because something's different about my implementation. So I created an issue, and then I needed to apply that change. So I went through the process that I'm going to talk about here a little bit. Then I took it one step farther and I said, well, my project is diverging so much from the project that was there that I ended up creating my own Drupal sandbox project that was basically a fork of the original project. So at this point, I'm no longer submitting patches back to the original project because there were so many of them concurrently sitting there for review that it wasn't practical anymore for me to keep on doing that. So now if we look at the issue, let's see. So I'm going to take an example issue from this particular project. I don't know if you guys are familiar or if you've gone through the process of applying a patch. Probably some of you have, some of you haven't. In Composer, that is. That process before was you would go in here and you would see the various comments. There would be a patch that was attached, like this one here, commerce chase number.patch. And then you would take a link to that and you would then go over to your project in the Composer JSON file. You would include the Composer patches project, and then you would specify the actual patch and the link to the patch and do a Composer install.
Can you show us that patch file for a moment, Mike?
Yeah. So do you want to see I was wondering if you wanted to see, here, let me just change this up a little bit. Do that. All right. So can you see my editor?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here's our Composer file. I was describing this particular thing here, this package, Composer patches, that adds the functionality for us to be able to then add this section down here at the bottom that I have, where each time I need to apply a patch to a particular project, I create an entry here. So none of these are the project that I was just talking about because of some of the directions that I ended up going with that. But typically, you would get the link for this directly from the comment section. So going back to that here. So let's, like Jonathan was saying, we can look at the patch file. And
yeah, I just thought it was worth showing how, like, what a patch is actually doing. It seems mysterious, but it's very simple, actually.
Yes, it can be far more complicated than, at least in looking at it, than this one is. This is about as simple as it gets, which is why I chose it as an example. But this one is essentially saying, okay, here's the file that I care about, posted payment form. In that file, I want to take away this line and add this line and this line, which is just changing up just the spelling of the label or adding spaces to it to match what it needed to be for Chase. So that's in essence all a patch file is. It's saying what lines are you taking away and which ones are you adding and where do you want to do that at. And it's a standard. So let's see. Back here, the previous way, like I was saying, was setting up. Everybody was responsible for generating that patch. And I won't go into the process, I don't think, unless you guys would find it helpful for actually generating a patch. Although I will be talking a little bit about that for my process. It was the developer's responsibility to create this file and then upload it. Moving ahead to their new processes that they put in place this past year, there's this idea of you creating a fork. So when you have an issue, they helpfully provide all of the information you need to basically clone the repository. You're creating a new repository that's a mirror image of the project that you care about. You then clone that down. It's yours to do whatever you want with it. You make changes and then you push them up, and at a point, presumably you get it to a point where you want to take those changes and request that they make it into the actual trunk of the project, the mainline project. And to do that, you this button, there's a button actually that is shown here that you can't see now, but you can request that you can submit a pull request or a merge request, and that would indicate to the project's owner that someone has submitted code for your review that you could add to the project. What I initially thought was that this meant patch files were out of the picture, which was a little bit of a concern for me, even though this process has countless benefits in terms of being able to manage the code and also a lot of continuous integration things as far as testing and that stuff goes. Patch files are the way that we get these changes into our current code base. So it's what we need in order to use Composer in order to roll those in and actually use them, which at the end of the day is all we really care about. I mean, to a certain extent, we want to contribute back to Drupal, of course, but we're all working jobs that we're trying to meet deadlines, and that's what we ultimately care about. So, so getting a patch file was really the goal, and it took me a while to realize that if you look closely where my mouse is, there's this little plain diff there. It doesn't even look like a link. Well, if you click on that, it generates the patch for you. And then you can just use this as the link. And this would be the exact same thing as somebody uploading the patch file after they had made a change. So in essence,
Mike, does that stick around when the merge request is merged in, is resolved?
I guess I don't know because that hasn't happened to me.
Okay.
Yet. I've not successfully merged in anything. I don't know if that means that I'm terrible or what, but so this tiny little non-link looking thing is actually the thing that we care about most when we're trying to roll this change into our current local code.
So I have a related question to Jonathan. So
yeah,
this is after you've created your fork, right?
This is after we've created the fork and we've pushed changes. And actually at this point, we've pushed changes and we've created a pull request, which means that we're ready for somebody to take the code that we've made and roll it into the project.
Okay, so that diff is based on the state as of when that pull request was made.
Correct. Yeah. So this diff is basically the difference between any changes I've made. It doesn't have to be, it can be in one commit, it can be in 10 commits. But it's the difference between the code that I've changed and the mainline trunk code of the project, which is all we really want. And it's a much better process, really, than relying on somebody to roll their own patch, because, of course, anytime somebody does that manually, there's always the chance that they might not actually roll it correctly and all of that.
But the diff file doesn't dynamically change every time you make a commit to your fork. It's tied to the pull request, right?
It's tied to the pull request, yeah. So it does update when you update the pull request. So I think I can't remember if I'm thinking too much about Bitbucket and not this particular scenario, but I believe that when you push more commits up after you've submitted a pull request, I think that gets included into your pull request automatically, and it regenerates that for you, which is not something you want to do, really. If you've notified other people to review your code, you don't want to be changing it on them. That's a good way to make someone angry, probably. Because really, as a developer, our goal is to get them to accept this as fast as possible and get it into the code so that we don't have to worry about patch files anymore. So does that make sense? I guess maybe I stop and just like that's kind of outlining the process of taking a project, finding out something that needs to change in it, making the change, creating a fork, making a change, requesting that your change goes back into the main project, and using the diff file. So let's take this one step further. Let's say, like me on this project, you have a number of changes that you want, not just one issue, but a number of issues. So let's look at the issue queue here. It's just a bunch of me saying, hey, I got another change. Hey, I got another change. Hey, I got another change. And when the thing about a patch file or a diff file is that it's very contextual to the situation that you're trying to deal with. So let's say that one I was just looking at, I wanted to change those 2 lines. Well, it was very specifically saying that at line, let's say 100, remove line 100 and add this new line at line 100. So what happens then if I go in and I create another issue and I create another patch and it changes lines, maybe at line 90, it says add 10 more lines at line 90. So now what was line 100 is now 110. You can see how it would get really messy and complicated really fast. So it's almost impossible to have this many patches at the same time and actually be using them all concurrently. Because as soon as you apply one, I shouldn't say that it's always going to be the case. A lot of times projects are big enough that you might provide a patch and it might touch one part of the code, and then you might provide another one and it touches another part of the code, and they can coexist peacefully. But as soon as you have very many, the chances are they're going to collide and you're going to have some issues actually doing that patch. So that actually is the big precursor to the actual topic that I wrote about. And that is, when we have all of these changes, what do you do instead of managing all these individual diff files? So for me, what I did was, I guess I'll just describe this, because I don't know if there's a great way to show this. There probably is if I would have prepped a long time, but I didn't do that. So as these issues, like we were looking at them before, when you create an issue, you have the option of creating this additional repository. Every time that you do this create an issue, what it really ends up doing is creating a different remote, basically, for the same repository. So actually, I will try to show this because I think that will be informative in my terminal. Let's see here.
You're just trying to make us jealous of your big screen.
Yeah. Gosh, I got to get this down to this miniature screen that I'm sharing. All right, let's see. Chase. All right, so what we're looking at here is basically the project that I was messing with. If I do a git remote, it shows me all the different remotes of this particular repository, and you can see these numbers they correspond to the different issue numbers. So each one is a different issue. So you have all these different remotes. When I'm working on issue 318-88536, I got to push to that one. It's pretty much it's kind of crazy to think about. You would actually be managing. I guess if you're a project manager, you would have to somehow come up with a workflow where you were managing all these different remotes. But for someone like me who's simply trying to get something to work, what made most sense to me was to create my own branch basically and continue working on that. And then what I would do is I would have the original, and so I would create one big diff that consisted of all of my changes from all of the issues and create one unified diff that would apply those changes to my project. And that's really what the article that I have posted deals with, and was, I guess, to some degree, the topic that I was going to talk about here. So
these are remotes, not branches, right? So you'd be creating branches within those?
Well, that's a little bit confusing too, because you do create branches that kind of correspond to these remotes too. So if I do git branch here, we have all of those issues as well. So sadly, I think you can set an upstream for each branch. Mm-hmm. So I think that maybe that helps in that regard. For each one of these branches, the upstream is set to that particular remote.
Different remote, okay.
So that probably does help actually when you're working on one particular issue. It helps you by pointing you in the right direction to push your code.
Okay.
You'll see here that I'm on branch RDG Garrison, that last one. That's one that I made that said, okay, instead of managing all of my changes in bits and pieces, I'm going to create one branch that has them all dumped in there plus some. And that's going to be the branch that I work on from now on. Sorry, open source community, but I'm doing this on my own now. So what that does then is it kind of makes all of your changes act as it's mainly just one big issue, even though that wouldn't necessarily make sense. And so this kind of brings me to that whole process of what do you do to generate a patch in the first place? And in this case, some of the things that helped me were, we have this project, Commerce Chase, which is a module, and it's sitting alongside as a sibling of my actual project that I'm working on. So we have this custom project, and then we have the Commerce Chase project, which is actually the open source project that we're working on. If I want to take any changes that I've made here and apply them, let's see, I go down to something like this. So,
so that's creating a patch there, right?
Yes, but so I guess backing up a little bit, in our other project, if we have a custom patch, we only talked about pulling in patches from the actual issue queue. if you have your own patch that you've made yourself, you can put that in your project and put a link to it. So what this is saying here is that I'm going to do a diff, which is the command that creates that diff file for patching. And I want to compare between what I'm currently working on here and origin 2.x. 2.x being the trunk, the release that is currently the recommended release by the developer. So that's what's, and that would be the one that I also have in my composer file. That's where I guess that would be important. You have to match that with whatever you're using. So what happens then running this command is it will take and create a diff file or a patch file for all of the changes, and it will put it in my project patches directory, which can be anything, but for a standard, that's what we use. And let me switch back over to the project real quick. So you'll see here, we have this patches directory that sits in the project. And what that command does is creates the diff file and puts it into my custom project. And then I can run composer update. And as long as this line is included, it will see that it has changed and it will apply those. Now, the reason why this makes sense and kind of streamlines the whole process is because I can be working on, really when you're working on a module, unless you've written unit tests, it's kind of difficult to see the changes that you've made and know that they're doing what you want it to do. So in this case, I would able to make changes in that project, run the diff command, it updates the file here. I would run composer update, and now my code that I'm building in my project is using the changes that I made to that project. And at this point, I can test it and make sure things are working as I intended, and also allows me to not have to worry about managing multiple issues. So
you go through that cycle for every change that you make. Then, as you're developing it, you make it in this other directory.
Every change that you want to test on your site, you can obviously work on the contributed module as much as you want, but anytime you want to see it in the context of the site that you're working on, you would need to do this. Another strategy that I've used if I'm really starting to iterate through and not exactly sure how I change the code is I'll go to where Composer actually puts things. So I look here in modules contrib, we'll find a commerce chase module. Now, any changes I make to this module here will be blown away the next time I do any type of code composer update or install, because this code is not meant to be modified. But
you could make a change here and then copy it out over.
Yeah, that's basically what I end up doing. So I make changes here. It's a fragile process because you make changes and you have to remember to copy those changes out to another project. It's not something that you would advise somebody to do lightly, I think, especially if you're an open source project getting people to contribute. So that is the dirty way of testing your changes as fast as possible, making changes right in the project, testing them immediately without running any type of composer command. And then when things are working the way that you want, copy over that code that you've changed to the module and do what we were discussing before, pushing it, making a merge request, any of those things. When you run composer update in order to then get those changes, which is a good idea. Once you've copied any changes that you've made out to the project, you're going to want to go through that composer update process to make sure that you actually copied everything you needed and test it to make sure it's working. But when you do run composer update, it will warn you that you've made changes to files that that are being managed by composer. So you shouldn't have been able to say that, you're going to overwrite some changes here. Are you sure? And in this case, we're sure because we've copied the changes out elsewhere. But that it gives you a whole bunch of options like yes, no. Do you want to overwrite them? Do you want to put them next to them? Do you want to copy them and put them? Like they give you like I think 5 different options, and it can be a little bit confusing. But basically, you want to blow them away and replace them, which sounds intimidating when you're making changes. You don't want to blow anything away, but that's what you do. So, yeah, I think that's the gist of it. That's the gist of my patch workflow. It's not pretty, and there's a lot of different scenarios that could go any number of ways. And for this particular scenario with this project that needed lots of changes, that's what worked for me.
So we had discussed whether there was some way to have this, for this example, this Commerce Chase folder actually be a checkout of that project, so you could make your changes right there.
Yeah.
And so far,
I didn't figure out a way to do that. That would be nice. No doubt somebody has figured that out someplace.
Problem, of course, is that then your composer will mess that up the next time you'd run.
Yeah, it would be really cool if composer had a specific way to handle those situations. Maybe that's
I don't think actually doing that is all that hard, but as long as you are no longer managing with composer, that's the
exactly.
that's the clinch. You can check it out and sit it there and enable it, and you'd be off and running. But
right, and if you deploy things like when we push out code, we're not pushing out any of these modules here. We're pushing out a composer file, and then composer is installing it on the server. So that's the other thing, is if you want to get the code anywhere but your local computer, composer has to be the one, at least in our particular case.
So that brings up a question. I was just actually thinking a couple of days ago, we have a small little like utility module that we've ended up, I think I'm on my 4th site where I'm using it, just like add some views features. And I've been thinking like it'd be nice to be able to install that with composer on sites rather than try to manage all of this. So you guys, have you ever done that? Try to publish something that composer.
Are you talking specifically about features or Drupal 8?
No, Drupal 8.
Okay.
It's a new Drupal 8 module that we've written.
Oh, I see.
And I don't necessarily want to make it public, even for my own use. I'd like to be able to just use Composer to manage that.
Yeah, that's something we've worked through recently, actually.
Yeah.
There's a couple of ways you can do that. You can specify a Git repository specifically, as long as the code if Composer has a way to have permission to get that code. So you have to work through some permissions stuff, I think. Is that right, Jonathan?
Yes.
There's a custom, there's a designation you got to make in the Composer file, Composer JSON file, to tell it where to get it from, right?
Yep, exactly. There's a couple things you can do too, like in that Composer file. There's also this idea of, well, maybe this is where you have to do it. Yeah, repository. So
there's been a couple modules that I've used with it. they weren't real friendly with composers, and they required you to make some modifications to this section.
Yeah. Yeah, and so
Yeah.
then,
I can show what we ended up doing for our own.
yeah,
So this is a good example for a sandbox.
yeah. So that's a
And
different,
I don't know if that's going off topic. You don't have to go there, but it's
I
kind of another
might-
way of managing that
Mhm.
that scenario that you find yourself in,
yeah.
possibly.
Yeah, this is kind of Drupal specific. I don't know if it's Drupal specific or
No,
not. This is
that's a general way you can do if anything that is in a Git repository
okay.
that is accessible. You can put the URL there to that particular, and then when you actually include it, the require statement is a bit different too, right? What does that look like?
Oh yeah, I think how did that pattern? I forget.
Farther down,
No, this is the one right here.
right? But is there a extras
Oh,
line?
I don't think so.
Installer paths, or yeah, how does it know? Oh, I know how it knows. It knows because in your sandbox project, it has a packages.json file
Oh, yeah,
that tells it.
yeah.
So
Yep.
you can, yeah, if you could host your, as long as it's a Git repository that that composer can reach. So Dan, you were saying you don't necessarily want to make it public.
That's the
So
catcher, right?
That is
The repo would have to be public, pretty much.
the easiest way is to make the repo public wherever it's sitting. However, you can make it private. When Composer runs its update or install, it will prompt you for credentials. That works fine. We ended up not doing that for ours because while it works okay when you're doing it by hand, that's difficult to then make work during a deployment. You need to make sure that every place you're deploying it has its own copy of those credentials. And for our workflow, where we're making and disposing of environments all the time, it was just more trouble than it was worth. And we determined that the code that we're producing that way is as close to open source. I mean, it's code that other people wouldn't care about because it's too specific, but it's not really proprietary.
Yeah, right.
So we were
Yeah,
okay
that's
with
kind
putting it
of the way this is. When I say I wouldn't necessarily want to make it public, it's not because there's anything trade secrets or proprietary information in there. It's more like it's like not really ready for consumption in terms of any open source standards or testing or anything like that. You know?
So we determined that public but obscure was good enough for us.
Yeah.
And then Mike took that a step further for our use. We're just rolling this out now. Mike, if you can scroll up a little, or actually I'll share mine. Mike built this, this is the right one. I thought this was the right, this is the wrong Viking project. Digital Solutions, one of these. I thought I had it ready to go, sorry. No, that was the one. Maybe I just don't have. Well, I'm on master. I don't know why I'm not seeing this here. I need to. look that up. But basically, the short version is that this type composer is different than type Git in that you're pointing to an entire registry of multiple modules, multiple packages.
Yeah, so that Drupal prefix in those requires refers to that whole thing,
Yes.
right? That's why that prefix is necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that's the project where we started actually using this, but let me
Yeah, so there's there's open source software that you can use to generate. Okay, there you go.
so we have this. So we had some we have our own repository that this is the thing that Mike set up using software called Satis that basically emulates packages.org or packages.drupal.org. It does the same kind of thing. So now we can just require
awesome.
our own rapid development group / for our own packages. And then those go in
that's
there.
really what I'd like to do, just like that.
It's a lot nicer than specifically having the Git URL of every single package you want. There are a couple things you need to do to make that work, and that's probably enough for an entire topic by itself.
Yeah.
But that, just broadly speaking, that can work.
Yeah, and it's, this particular thing, it's not a lot of changes. I mean, it's a couple of new filters for views. I mean, 3 or 4 things, but now that it's between 3 or 4 sites even, and I haven't even put it in a repo. So it's like a lot of, cross site management. And I don't even know, I couldn't tell you what's current, and, so it's a mess, and I've got to solve that one way or the other, at the very least, get it in a repo. But then you have the composer issues, like we said before. You've got a kind of one-off module sitting in your project. It's
a double-edged
not managed
sword
by
because
people.
you want that ability to make a change once and have it apply to all your projects. But once you commit to that, the downside is that you make one change and you have to take all of those projects that are using it into consideration.
Yeah.
Now the upside,
it'll end up with kind of a least common denominator kind of thing,
Yeah. Now, however, this approach does allow you to use versioning.
Right,
So
that's true.
you will have releases, and you can pin a project to a particular release. So you don't have to worry about.
That's true, yeah. And just freeze it there.
Yeah, at least it won't go everywhere without testing.
Yeah, exactly. The testing even has been my concern. But then, yeah, that's a good point. If you froze it at that version, it would alleviate that. Yeah, that's good stuff. So going kind of back on topic, I did a lot of manual patch. I shouldn't say a lot. I mean, 3 or 4 instances of where I had to do manual patch management back in the Drupal 7 days, which was a lot of fun, and was real happy to see that Composer Patches project come out. And I had an occasion to use it a couple of times. I don't think those sites need it anymore because I think the patch caught up, in the release. But I don't remember because it's been probably a 1.5 years, 2 years. But it doesn't seem like it worked consistently and reliably to get those patches applied. Have you found it to be pretty bulletproof?
Yeah, we pretty much we're pretty much making the assumption that it's going to work.
Yeah, the only gotchas that I've run into are cases where it doesn't always, making a change to that section of the Composer JSON file won't always tell Composer this needs to be recalculated. So often you'll need a Composer update rather than a Composer install to tell it to look for all those patches.
Yeah, I don't even remember what happened. So Yeah, but it's good to know, because I've pretty much abandoned it because it didn't seem to work right. But it's good to know that it has been working for you really well. So if I need it in the future.
It's a pretty core part of our workflow.
So Michael, have you had, this was really of interest to me because I've had a couple of occasions where I've tried to contribute back, to the community. And I just went and looked at, my list of contributions here, and I just see this one where this particular module, and it was a views add-on, as a matter of fact, and it was pretty non-functional the way it was. Like, it was a pretty glaring, huge bug. And I did the old school method of posting a patch in the comments. And then, 1 year and 5 months later, I have not heard anything about what happened to that. And, it was pretty frustrating to think I was doing the right thing, open source right thing. And then nobody cared that I had fixed their module, it seemed like. So if you found with that pull request, do you have much experience actually getting those accepted and merged in?
I wish I could say that, it's better. It's hard to say. I think that's kind of a common issue unless you're making changes to something that is
Web
used
form or
by a lot of
something like
people,
that, yeah.
and a lot of people are suffering from that issue, which I guess just in the world that we live in, we're not so bleeding edge that we're toying with things that really impact other people that way. Most of the changes and patches we make seem to be obscure enough that they're kind of specific to us. And so when that, unfortunately, that's been my experience too, Dan. You you submit patches up there and they sit there and they require you really, I guess, poking somebody or
Advocate for them.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care that much. That's the problem. What did you say, Jonathan?
Unfortunately, people are involved.
Yeah. I mean, I can see it from their perspective. It's not that high priority. They're in the same boat as we are. They're not getting paid to bother with, that.
And
Test is a silver bullet that nobody uses.
And having been on the other side of that, it's been years, but when I was maintaining modules, I can say from that perspective, it's pretty likely that there is an initial frenzy of activity when the person writing it is using it in an active project, or is passionate about it. And then it gets to a point where it's working for them, and the initiative to keep changing things, it goes down.
Right.
It's not that it's not there. It's just that there's likely that there are other things that are front burner for them. It's a common problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Open source is hard. I don't know how these big projects manage it all, to be honest.
Yeah.
Well, it's been just very much off topic, but coming from decades of being a .NET developer, Microsoft Stack, and then 5 years of this, it's very interesting to have that perspective of the pros and cons on both sides.
Yeah. Yeah, because
some things I love about this world and some things I hate.
Yeah,
and vice versa. Like, looking back now,
I've used plenty of proprietary modules, I guess, even though that might not be the word that was being used, but with things in other frameworks, I guess, that certainly had their own bugs. And you just follow a different process of getting changes, and you file a support ticket. And, depending on how good the project is, maybe you get some help, maybe you don't, but I guess someone's getting paid for it that way, so maybe you get a little more attention.
Well, thank you very much for presenting this month, Mike.
Yeah, that was good stuff. I just actually had noticed that fork link recently, and wondered what that was all about. So that's perfect.
Great.
Good timing.
I have a quick question, Mike. So related to that whole new process, when you submit a pull request, does that automatically create an issue? Or how does the issue part?
Yeah, so you create the issue. So
Oh, okay.
you can think about it like you make the complaint. You
Okay.
offer you offer the complaint on Drupal, and then it says, well, do you want to be the owner of this complaint? And you're like, okay, fine, I'll fix it. So then you fix it and
You make the Stack Overflow question.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
So it helps you to create that fork from the issue you created, right?
Okay.
Yeah,
That's okay. That's what I missed. Gotcha.
yeah. And so then it's doing a lot of things on Drupal's repository.
So I think the logic is you might report an issue without having a solution, but you'll never have a solution unless there's an issue.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I just thought of what, I was gonna ask a question and then it hit me. I think that might have been what happened when I was using that Composer patches. My question was gonna be, how often have you found that the module drifts far enough where your patches won't apply anymore?
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened to me.
It
Yeah.
happens, and fortunately, most of the time when it happens, it's because that the patch isn't relevant anymore because it was accepted. But otherwise, you can look to see if there's a new version, and I'm most of the time someone has already re-rolled it. And you have to update the URL.
Those patches, I had the impression, just because of, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think I've seen cases where the scenario you described, where some lines are inserted above and it changes that line number, that I thought that Git kind of interprets that as around line 108, look for these lines.
Yeah,
I think there's some
Try to
smarts to
change
it.
them.
yeah, the patch utility is old and pretty impressive, actually, with how it can deal with those what they call fuzzy matches. But there's a limit, of course, to how
But
far.
at some point, yeah, and I think that is the actual what happened to me, because then I started getting all these errors that it couldn't apply the patch.
Because it uses
Yeah.
both the line numbers and the context. So it looks at a few
Yeah.
lines before and a few lines after and tries to match those up too. But if both of those things are wrong, then it pretty much has to.
So the advantage of this approach now that they're using is that automatically generated diff, in theory, would update
Right.
when other things change that are relevant. The thing I don't fully understand is why they made it the smallest link ever and didn't even make it look like a link. You think that would be the highlighted, but
I think that's our big takeaway. Mike found the tiny link.
I found a tiny link that unlocks the universe patches.
Thank you, Ken.
Good stuff as always.